On October 2nd, this past fall, there was, and some of you, I'm sure, remember that, an event in honor of Henrietta Lacks at the School of Medicine on a Saturday. A week or two before that event, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times that was simply stunning. It was an article that described that in the work and discovery on the Tuskegee experiments, for which so much has been written, another absolutely breathtakingly horrifying event had occurred in Guatemala with Guatemalan prisoners, where in the 1940s and in the early 1950s, not only was the natural course of disease followed, but they were inoculated with the disease. And I remember that Saturday, some of us talking about that work. And I remember speaking with Ruth and saying, would there be a possibility to invite to Baltimore Susan Reverby, whose work and who uncovered in exploring Tuskegee the Guatemalan experiments as well. Professor Reverby is the Marion Butler McLean Professor. I really like this. In the History in Ideas at Wellesley College. She's a professor of women's and gender studies. She is a researcher, an historian, a political activist, has served on the FDA in a consumer advisory panel, and has been very, very involved in studying and exploring issues of gender, of race, history, public policy, and their interface. So we are thrilled. And we look forward to your presentation, Susan. Thank you so much for coming.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out, especially on such a beautiful day. And I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear me okay in the back? Is that good? Okay, good. After nearly 40 years of talking to the media, yeah, I'm that old, and yeah, I started really young, on various kinds of health, feminist, and race issues, you would have thought I would have known better. Nevertheless, I was not quite prepared for the onslaught and some of the questions. I was, however, ready for the melodrama. The problem became realizing once again there was no simple way to escape it. My most recent scholarship, as you've heard, has explored two troubling studies in American medical research history. The United States Public Health Study of untreated syphilis in the male Negro, better known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972, for which then President Bill Clinton apologized in 1997. So if you're interested in this, this is my edited book on Tuskegee. This is my most recent book called Examining Tuskegee. And I have also written on the U.S. Public Health Service Inoculation Sexually Transmitted Diseases Studies in Guatemala, 1946 to 48, that received, as you heard, worldwide attention and a U.S. government apology from our current president, as well as the Secretaries of State and Health and Human Services to Guatemala just this past fall. This is an example of the coverage in Guatemala of the study. This is the New York Times story that came on October 2nd. Each of these studies involved the powerful U.S. government focused on primarily poor and rural African American men in one case, and Guatemalan prostitutes, mental patients, soldiers, and prisoners in the other. Each entailed deceptions, lack of any serious consenting procedures, and life-threatening diseases. The study in Tuskegee went on for 4 decades, as hundreds of African-American men, 439 with late-stage syphilis and 185 controls without the disease, were watched but not supposed to be treated. This is a photo of Eunice Rivers Laurie, the African-American nurse who's the go-between the Public Health Service and the men in the study, handing out a packet of aspirins. In the study, this is her out handing an iron tonic to a man in one of the cotton fields. This is a picture of one of the diagnostic spinal taps that was explained to the men as a special treatment. And then this is a poster of the concept of the use of the term bad blood to mean syphilis. The study in Guatemala, in contrast, extended for 3 years, recruited nearly 1,500 men and women, and involved infecting them with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, and then treating the majority of them, but not all totally, once they demonstrated infection. And this is the front page of my article. Each study, of course, conjures up almost primordial and powerful fears of our lack of control of our own bodies, of the dangers of those with great power, the terror of trusting physicians, scientists who respond with what many see as close to medical torture, the racism of treating people of color as the other, both in our own South and in the global South. Each had physical procedures that are fairly horrific and almost pornographic, diagnostic spinal taps that are described instead as special treatment in Tuskegee, and the use of prostitutes' spinal punctures and the abrading of men's penises to deliver the disease inoculums in Guatemala. Each of them was about a dreadful disease that is primarily sexually transmitted. And this is a, let's see. Okay, that one didn't come up. Okay. The task of the historian is, of course, to uncover the facts, to understand the memories, and provide nuance about historical contingencies and explore contemporary lessons, not just to tell these stories over and over again within a simple storyline. None of this, however, has been easy, especially in the face of strong beliefs about what the stories are really supposed to be about and the seemingly obvious ethical lessons to be drawn. This is especially difficult, I think, in medical histories that play a key role in bioethical considerations. For in much of bioethics, as many of you know, cases of infamous wrongdoing play a crucial role, serving almost as what critic Sack Van Berkovich called American Jeremiads, named after the Lamentations of the biblical prophet Jeremiah. This is the painting on the top of the Sistine Chapel of Jeremiah, in which moral outrage is often emphasized and a temporal sense of the bad old days explains the need for current vigilance. Furthermore, I am more than aware that as a northern white woman analyzing histories in which racism and/or imperialism play important roles, I need to name racism and imperialism even when I try to move on and consider other factors. If I don't name them directly, it is assumed I'm either callous or thoughtless. Given rumors and other explanations too, my efforts require acknowledging and knowing what the beliefs are already, even as I try and say what else might be known. And in the face of the media onslaught over these horrific issues, the difficulties of remaining the careful, thoughtful academic who always wants to say things are kind of more complex becomes even harder. How then was it possible at all to do this, and should I have even tried? When his own pastor's incendiary words forced then-candidate Barack Obama to give what is referred to as his race speech, this is a picture of him doing this in Philadelphia 3 years ago, his oratory provided me, thankfully, with a frame for some of my concerns. Obama reminded us we needed to think more complexly about race, but he claimed we are often limited in our approaches, for he argued, and I quote, "We have a choice in this country. We can tackle race only as spectacle, as we did in the O.J. trial, or in the wake of tragedy, as we did in the aftermath of Katrina, or as fodder for the nightly news." This formulation struck me completely as I was finishing my book on the study in Tuskegee, and I was rereading the scholarship of others on the problems of formulaic stories, sentimentality, and melodrama. For I, too, was trying to move away from a story about racism that did not focus on either spectacle or tragedy, and that did not play out in this melodramatic, we already know what happened perspective. I was cognizant, too, as historians often are, of film director Sidney Lumet's, in which he argues in a well-written drama, the story comes out of the characters. The characters in a well-written melodrama come out of the story. Historians, of course, to explain to you what he's saying here, want to be writing drama where our historical figures create the story, not melodramas where we already know the story and the characters just fill in. When it comes to public discussions, of course, and fictional representations of racism, it's often the melodrama where the story drives the characters, happens first. And this is clear in a very good book by a woman named Linda Williams called Playing the Race Card Melodramas of Black and White, From Uncle Tom to O.J. Simpson. These stories are often written and performed with great sentimentality, even with swelling music in the original forms, where, as cultural critic Jane Hopkins argued, the story is awash with emotion, but does nothing to remedy the evil it deplores. And yet we know, as artist and poet William Blake so eloquently reminded us, and I tell this to my students every year, for a tear is an intellectual thing. How then do we both accept and overcome the melodramas that play out in both of these medical research studies as we seek to understand the past and make reasonable social policy based on it? Critic Linda Williams provides some guide here in her analysis of the melodrama of race that gets seen in America both in actual experiences, think Clarence Thomas, the confirmation hearings of the first O.J. trial, and in books and plays and films such as Uncle Tom's Cabin, Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, Roots, and The Green Mile. These kind of melodramas, she argues, are so embedded in our national consciousness, they're almost impossible to escape. Even with the awareness of the multiple meanings of race and the complex racial makeup of our country, these are stories told primarily literally in black and white. Such repeated views, whether of black people as in the binary of evil and dangerous on the one hand or Christ-like victims in the other, forms the paradigms that we use for understanding our racial past. They are often present, she argues, at moments when our concerns are the most confused. As with Obama, then, she is arguing that these kinds of simple spectacles and tragedies performed in melodramatic tones are the way we talk, view, and organize our thinking about race, even when we think we're not doing it, and even when we wish to escape it. For she's suggesting in this emotional register, or Blake's moment of tears, that cross-racial recognition arises and the demand for citizenship becomes founded, not on understanding of rights, but on victimhood. Williams and Obama, therefore, seem to be asking us that we take this up, that we understand that our speaking about this is organized by this kind of emotional plea, and that we ought to struggle to analyze it and to overcome it. And you can imagine then the appeal of this kind of analysis to a feminist scholar who does not believe that victimhood alone should be the basis for rights, and who thinks there are real limits to moral outrage and guilt as a basis for genuine social change. I always tell my students if they want guilt, they can talk to my mother. All well and good, I say, this call for analysis in a scholarly tome or in a presidential oratory, but how then do you do this in my own scholarship and in an 140-character media-driven world? How could I recognize the need, inevitability perhaps, of the racial melodrama, especially in these paradigmatic bioethical cases, while trying to have my characters tell their story and not have their story shape their historical experience? I tried mightily to do this. I succeeded sometimes. My defeat often probably inevitable. And now I'll be specific about how this happened. I first realized that this was a problem when I began to lecture on the initial work I was doing on the study in Tuskegee nearly 2 decades ago. I was confronted with the belief, and I'm sure many of you have heard, that the men in the study there had been given syphilis by the United States Public Health Service, not had the disease already. This understanding is everywhere, from the most sophisticated scholars to the nightly news broadcasters to the endless internet iterations. The belief is enforced when images of the blood draw in Alabama in the 1950s are cropped to show a white hand on a syringe as the needle enters a black arm, or even in this case of a black hand, Nurse Rivers, on a black arm. Even Obama's former pastor, Jeremiah Wright, referred to this belief in his Goddamn America sermon that forced Obama's race speech in the first place. This viewpoint is indeed summed up in 140 characters when a 2009 Twitter post warned, I love this, "Don't take the swine flu vaccine. Remember the Tuskegee Experiment syphilis vaccine." There was, however, neither infecting in Tuskegee nor, I wish we had this, a syphilis vaccine, of course. To understand why this belief still circulates, is to accept that the study was never, from its very first public exposure, merely an historical event. It became almost an American allegory, a way to explain the dangers and fears that lurk every time a patient or subject places their lives in a stranger's hands, whether for clinical care or research trial. There is a reason some of our earliest horror stories and films focus on the dangers of unchecked medical madness and the sexualized power of doctors over the innocent. So this is a film came out very early called The Cabinet of Dr. Kilgary. This is H.G. Wells' The Island of Lost Souls. And in 1931, the year before Tuskegee starts, of course, the first Frankenstein. The assumption of infecting with a potentially deadly disease in the Tuskegee Study fits this old idea. Knowledge of the Nazi and Japanese World War II experiments and also the infecting of patients with cancer cells at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, or the provision of live hepatitis virus to children hospitalized with mental retardation at the Willowbrook State School get confounded. Bioethics texts and ethics lectures add to this confusion when discussions of immoral research begin with the Nazis and the Japanese and then move quickly across the ocean to Tuskegee. The monster doctors are infecting the vulnerable, with people of color almost always provided as the most vulnerable, is a powerful tale, even if failing to treat and deception, and was done in Tuskegee, is in some ways, I think, much more normative and in many ways more horrible for its familiarity. The study in Tuskegee, along with slavery and lynching, therefore, becomes yet another example of what happens to African Americans who are not valued as rights-bearing citizens. So I want to remind you, this is a wonderful picture of three of the men in the study. I just love the guy in the middle. I just think it's a fabulous and beautifully dignified picture. This is a group of the men outside one of the churches in Tuskegee as well. And this is a picture of some of the men in the study at the Apology. And this is 5 of the men also at the Apology in 1997. The narrative, of course, of Tuskegee rests on the racial and class-based vulnerability of the African-American men in the farms and small towns of rural Alabama at the height of the Depression, when the study began, to the offer of free care from public health officials. The detail that syphilis, although a dangerous and powerful disease that can cause great pain, suffering, and even death, might not kill everybody, becomes irrelevant to the story as it's told. There's also an assumption that the story is timeless, as if nothing changed during those 4 decades in Alabama. In telling the story this way, none of the men in the study or their families have any power and are available as victims only in a timeless tale. The stories, therefore, contend that the government's power was so widespread that all the men were continually tracked and none of them got to treatment ever. It is true that the Public Health Service tried to stop any of them from being drafted during World War II, where treatment would have been possible. My research, however, tried to tell a more complicated accounting, not to excuse what happened, but to explain it. When many of the study's unwitting participants left Alabama to be part of the great migration of African Americans out of the rural South to the urban cities, the PHS did try to track them to see if they could be found and checked on. But the letters exchanged by the public health officials did not tell other doctors not to treat them. The men's medical records, recently made available at the Southeast National Archives in Morrow, Georgia, suggest that at least some who survived into the antibiotic era in the post-World War II period found their way to curative penicillin either because of other ills or because their new doctors had no idea they were in the study. By the end of the study, therefore, and before its public exposure, the Public Health Service researchers had to admit to one another that it had become a study of undertreated, not untreated syphilis. These facts, I think, matter as we try to understand the complexity of the experience of the study in Tuskegee and remain transfixed over what actually did happen. The facts serve as a reminder of historian Alice Kessler Harris's great argument that, quote, without a history, public policy follows the path of social myth. But what can be misremembered, the narratives also speak to a larger truth about the sense of we make of the past and contemporary fears of medical power. This narrative plays out both at the patient and doctor side of medical experiences and research. Tuskegee, as a one-word epithet, and many of you, I'm sure, have used it or heard it, has been used to critique the placebo antiviral trials for HIV/AIDS in Uganda, to condemn the studying of children here at Kennedy Krieger in the lead-painted apartments, to attack state funding for stem cell research, to even explain the possibility, Spike Lee said this, that the government intentionally blew up the levees in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and now, of course, the studies in Guatemala, which I'll speak about in a minute. It is often assumed on very bad and scant research that knowledge of Tuskegee keeps African Americans from clinical trials and even medical care. However, more recent sophisticated research studies demonstrate that Black Americans are as likely as whites to participate in clinical trials, and that knowledge does not always translate into fear or refusal. What happened, I think, to Grandma last time she waited for hours at a hospital is more likely to engender distrust today than knowledge of a study that ended 4 decades ago. It just becomes the word to explain it. But the melodrama of the monster doctor infecting continues. The melodrama of Tuskegee also has a powerful figure in that of Hermann Shaw. This is Mr. Shaw. He was the spokesman for the men at the Apology, and here he is with President Clinton. Mr. Shaw is a key figure in several of the documentaries about the study and spokesman for the men at the Apology. For Mr. Shaw, as I have written in the book, argues in his legal statements, before a Senate hearing, and in fictional form in the film Miss Evers' Boys, that he was kept from getting treatment at a public health rapid treatment center. So in the play and in the stories as they're told, here's this moment where it looks like he's going to escape Tuskegee. He goes to Birmingham and he's turned away at this rapid treatment center. And it's usually seen as the most horrific moment in the study where he's almost made it out. I explained, of course, that if you look at the records of the public health project that was in these rapid treatment centers, that in fact no one in the non-contagious stage of the disease was being treated. They were only treating people who were infectious. And they say that in the newspaper accounts at the time in 1947. So was Mr. Shaw turned away because they knew he was in the study and therefore assumed he wasn't infectious, or was because he was in the study part of the conspiracy to keep him out of treatment? And the reality is, once you look at his medical records, is that in the 1950s he got pneumonia and he was hospitalized in a hospital near Tuskegee for 20 days, and he got penicillin every single day to treat his pneumonia. So while the study went on for the next 40 years, much, I have argued, would change in rural Alabama, even if the lack of change is what is often emphasized, as if the study took place outside of historical time and the folk part of the unchanging melodrama. But not every man in the study was the same, and the records show that some of the others did indeed escape to treatment. Indeed, by the end of the study and before the media coverage, which I think is crucial here, the records show that others got treated and that the PHS researchers were acknowledging that they had essentially been defeated because so many people had gotten out. It suggests that our focus just on what the Public Health Service tried to do, our horror of what they did, and our need to have the study be a particular kind of melodramatic story, and rightly to acknowledge the racism at the heart of it, makes us ignore these other stories. Now, when I speak about this, I have tried to stop at this point and say directly to my audience, if we ask these questions about the study, it need not undermine our anger over what happened any more than understanding slave revolts or runaways undermines our revulsion over slavery. I try to slow down my New York voice and say this really carefully, acknowledging my audience usually understands something else. But in laying open the possibility that some of the men who survived into the antibiotic era made it to treatment, or that the treatments of the earlier years might have affected their later health outcome, I think we contribute to changing the narrative of total annihilation that's part of the Tuskegee mantra. We stop adding to the contribution to the view of African Americans as only easily available subjects, even if that's what the PHS intended. Our black and white picture begins to provide a way to rethink the men as ubiquitous, helpless victims of a medical research juggernaut. It suggests a way we can rethink the meaning of the study as a metaphor for genocide, and the ways the research community, frankly, might come to remember that subjects can undermine their scientific result in hidden ways. Now, this knowledge, however, does not undermine the anger that there was never a real apology until 1997, or that any of the doctors, I get this a lot, were ever charged with any crimes. To at least get an apology, I worked with others for nearly 2 years to arrange for President Bill Clinton to do just that in 1997. The actual ceremony, filled with dignity and pomp at the White House East Room, as you saw on May 16, 1997, with a satellite downlink to the conference center at Tuskegee University, provided a formal setting for the apology. With all the skill that his Southern upbringing and political savvy has given him, President Clinton concluded his sobering remarks by asking Mr. Shaw and the others for forgiveness. Both at the White House and at Tuskegee, many commented over and over on the high and varying emotions of the event, the closure it provided for some, the simple but powerful effect of a president saying, "This was racist, and we are sorry." Much of the coverage, however, tried to milk the event for its passions and melodrama, not the larger questions of research policy gone awry. On CNN Live, for example, survivor family members were asked over and over again, "How do you feel?" It drove me crazy. The word emotional became the mantra repeated by the reporters. It was almost as if only in the context of emotionality could the pain of racial injustice and scientific arrogance become real or discussed. The horror of the study could seemingly only be communicated in to a television audience in the familiar daytime and somewhat religious format of confession and repentance. Such emotionality, while critical and cathartic, had no guarantee, of course, that it would become the basis for a real commitment to rethinking research procedures, racial injustice, or ethical precepts. It is a salve on a festering sore, the son of one of the study's unwitting participants noted. But apologies, as historian Johanna Schoen has argued, can be just rituals without coming to terms with history. Furthermore, the emphasis on racial injustice, however crucial, but not, as communication scholars looking at Clinton's speech several years ago noted, no focus really on medical ethics and the abuse of power. Science thus becomes value-free in this story as only racial politics, not something inherent in the way scientific ideas contain racial assumptions, becomes the cause of the study and at the center of what went wrong. The apology thus becomes an apology for racism, all needed, of course, but not really about the role of medicine and science in the creation of beliefs about race that started the study in the first place and underlie the racism. However, trying to say this in the media-driven situation becomes really difficult. This was brought home to me last October when I was interviewed by prize-winning independent journalist Amy Goodman on her widely broadcast show, Democracy Now! We were discussing the studies in Guatemala, more about this in a second, and other examples of research horrors. I was sitting in a video studio in Massachusetts watching a camera and listening to Goodman's questions through an earpiece. Unbeknownst to me, while I was speaking, she was showing photographs of Mr. Shaw from his 1993 Nova documentary, and listeners could hear him telling his story about being kept from treatment. When I tried to explain that actually Mr. Shaw had gotten to treatment, the story was a little more complex, it was practically impossible to get my story across, and Goodman and I got into a shouting match, actually. There I was, seemingly the calm, obviously middle-class white professor, sitting with the views of Charles River projected behind me, and in contrast, there was Mr. Shaw in his farmer clothes in Alabama telling his familiar story from the television documentaries 20 years ago. I came across, I think, as heartless and stupid, the academic who understood perhaps the nuances but somehow missed the major moral lesson. And Mr. Shaw, who I actually had come to know and love, was Christ-like in his victimization, his offering soft Southern cadences, and a sense of forgiveness for those who had harmed him. I think there I should never have tried to make my more complex story visible. The problem became even clearer, of course, when the news of the Guatemala story became worldwide phenomena. I had found the unpublished records of the study around 2005 while I was doing research on the Tuskegee book. Despite the fantasies of some tongue-in-cheek bloggers that I am, Julian Assange, I was not part of WikiLeaks. The story was too complicated to fit into the book I was finishing. I assumed it would just be this kind of small outtake article I would finish, and I didn't, in all honesty, see it that much different from other horrific medical research studies that I knew about. And I was fascinated by it because it had been run by Dr. John Cutler, who went on then to work in Tuskegee and who continued to defend the study well into the 1990s, particularly on the film documentaries. It provided me, I thought, and this is really important, with the scientific evidence to explain what it was necessary to do to give someone syphilis outside normal exposure and why this had not happened in Alabama. So it was clear that morally they would have done it. It's just the biology defeated them, and I now had the evidence to show how complicated this was biologically. I gave the paper at a professional medical historians meeting literally a year ago this week, but without much fanfare, and because medical historians don't find all of this quite so shocking. The article of my finding was to be published, as you saw, in a January 2011 obscure history journal called the Journal of Policy History on a special issue on human subjects. Now, this is how it becomes news. In the late spring, I gave a copy of the finished paper to David Sencer, a former director of the CDC, whom I had interviewed over his role in Tuskegee. David plays a not very good role in the Tuskegee Story, and he also was fired from his directorship at CDC. This is why the wanted for genocide thing comes up, because in 1977 he fought to have people have vaccine for swine flu, and he was summarily fired when the swine flu epidemic didn't really happen, and some people died from something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. So as a non-physician who only plays a syphilologist in my writing, I asked David to fact-check my story. But he was quite worried about other things than the facts. He was 85 at the time. He literally passed a week ago today. David recognized what I initially did not, that this was a very big story and that CDC had to get ahead of it. Having chaired himself a meeting in 1969 that which is considered a crucial turning point in the Tuskegee story, because he makes the decision as the director of CDC to let Tuskegee keep going in 1969. If he had stopped it then, we probably would never have actually heard about it. It's really amazing to think about it. So SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, which I had belonged to in college, even burned David in effigy outside of CDC offices after the story of the Tuskegee Study broke in '72. This time, I think, he was determined to do it right and to protect his former institution. With my permission, he sent my paper to the current leadership of CDC, in particular to Harold Jaffe, who is CDC's Associate Director of Science. After several conference calls with David and me in less than a month, and some checking about who I was through various channels, the CDC science leadership sent the country's head syphilologist, John Douglas, the man in the bottom here, to Pittsburgh, where I had originally found the archival material. Douglas's report that backed my findings and looked at the medical records much more carefully than I could showed that, at least from the evidence, 14% of those infected with syphilis were not given the right amount of penicillin, and this information was shared with NIH officials and then went up the chain of command to the DHSS, Department of Health and Human Services, and then to the White House Domestic Policy Council. Zeke Emanuel, also in this picture, the head of bioethics at NIH, became involved, and I suspect other people I don't even know about. What I had not been told, however, was that the government had given the story the night before to Robert Bazell, NBC's science correspondent. And when the story broke on the morning of October 1st, what happened was that Sebelius and Clinton apologized and called it abhorrent, unethical, and reprehensible. President Obama called President Colomb to express his deep regret, and then the Bioethics Commission was asked to look into this. But I was not told that the story had been given to Bazell the night before. So when I posted the story, which I had promised the CDC I would do my paper on my faculty webpage, it was already known in the news media, and then suddenly everybody started arriving to try and talk to me about it. What I thought was amazing was, of course, because nobody had any pictures in Guatemala, that immediately what shows up, gee, no surprise, is this picture of the injecting in Tuskegee, when the story, of course, is about Guatemala. So there was, as you can expect, statements of anger and outrage in Guatemala, but most newscasts just showed the stock footage of Guatemala or of Tuskegee, and instead talked to me because my findings of the seemingly hidden archive played better to the home audience. I had found the unpublished records in an archive. I had the story to tell. More importantly, I was available because the feds, after their news broadcast at 11, were no longer available to speak to anybody. So there I was at home with the one person. It's amazing how the US government works. It's quite stunning. Clearly and quickly, it became what the press wanted to know, and they were basically two major things. One, how had this happened, of course, and how did I feel when I found it, which I thought was amazing. How monstrous really was Dr. Cutler, the PHS doctor who had run the studies in Guatemala, while Nuremberg, of course, and the trials were going on? How did I feel? Why did anyone, I thought, even care how I felt? It was almost a kind of when did you stop beating your wife kind of question. Because when I said I was so shocked that this kind of study had gone on, one reporter wrote that I was obviously naive and didn't understand anything about the history of medicine, right? So much for my career. If I said I wasn't surprised, then I sounded as if I was sort of callous and thoughtless. Others made me sound as if I was just some researcher, one of my girlfriends noted this, right, who'd kind of accidentally found this material that was being hidden away, rather than a scholar who knew what she was looking at least not for the current value, at least for its historic value, and could write it up in a historically nuanced manner. I kept thinking of the great quote from Pester, who said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." I was criticized for not, I love this, by a 20-something, for not putting it up on my blog, which of course doesn't exist, immediately after I found it, as if somehow this would have gotten attention. My blogging should be so powerful. And then, of course, there were a couple of death threats because I was an unloyal American. That happened. Wasn't Cutler a Nazi doctor like Mengele, who had found refuge in Latin America, I was asked again and again. I tried hard to put Cutler in context, to discuss the ways in which his higher-ups were not so sure this was an acceptable research, but still had let it go on. I tried to explain the concerns with syphilis and why the search for chemical prophylaxis, that is something to prevent infection after exposure, really mattered. Sorry, turned around. The melodrama, however, provided a much more powerful story. Cutler became a Nazi doctor even in the cartoons. In Guatemala press, where Uncle Sam is looking in the mirror and sees Mengele smiling back. Or this one where Mrs. Clinton is apologizing to President Colomb, and the Guatemalans are saying, yeah, but what about the Cold War, the paramilitary groups, the demand for drugs, and the hate toward immigrants, which you also ought to apologize for, obviously. The Guatemalans became in the story hopeless and pure victims, although once it became clear enough, even when I tried to explain it, that even the United States government can't walk into a state penitentiary, a mental hospital, and an army barracks in Guatemala City in 1946 without somebody's permission, and that the Guatemalan government was deeply involved in it, just as the physicians in Tuskegee had been with that study, even if obviously there's an enormous difference in power. Why governments or medical professionals might agree to such a study in their under-resourced areas never gets much attention, and I think is really absolutely crucial to understand. Furthermore, there was the question of the visuals that in retrospect would have made the melodrama even more powerful. In the archives were hundreds and hundreds of photographs taken by Dr. Cutler's wife, Elise, a Wellesley College where I teach, alumna, no less, of the people in the study and of the actual inoculation procedures. The news media in my house asked me for visual materials, which of course I had. In a very quick split second, I decided I might not legally be able to release them, even though I had permission to publish them in my article. But more importantly, I thought about the photographs and what serious political consequences they might have. All I kept thinking about was the way the Tuskegee pictures had been used, Abu Ghraib, the Danish cartoons, and I thought about the almost sort of pornographic quality of the photographs and how I might feel if a photo of someone who could be my own grandfather and his abraded penises appeared on the web. I said no and supplied this medical record instead, which makes it pretty clear what they were doing because it explains what kind of rabbit they were using to do the study, how many times they applied the inoculum, that they held onto the man's penis for an hour and a half to make it clear. What's interesting about this is that I kept those photographs out, and as a footnote, the United States government took possession of the archives from the University of Pittsburgh, which is actually the good part of the story. They are now in the National Archives in Morrow, Georgia, and about a month ago, the United States National Archives actually released all of the material on the web, including the photographs. And to my great relief, no one has sort of picked up on them, and it's really interesting about how 6 months later nobody is looking any longer. People have moved on. The story doesn't have the same power, so the photos don't. It's just a picture of a hand on a penis, and you can get 1 million of those on the web, so nobody cares. It's really stunning, and I think on October 1 they would have. Much of the story in October depended on who wrote it, of course, and where in the world it went, and played out with all the melodrama, the physical violation of men's private parts, the use of U.S. taxpayer dollars to infect prostitutes and to send them into a prison to have sex with men, the power of the U.S. government in a global South country, innocent victims, the horror of the abuse of medical research authority while we were prosecuting Nazi doctors, the sexual nature of it all. Again, the emotions of the responses of the government secretaries who called it abhorrent and terrible, my own findings, and those of the people in Guatemala galvanized the press coverage that went around the world within the week and meant I was fielding questions from everyone from the BBC to the Chinese National Agency, to whom I did speak, and to Al Jazeera, an Iranian state television whose interviews I actually turned down because I wasn't sure exactly how to talk to them. And at least, of course, 3 filmmakers made contact, and of course, you'll appreciate this, 4 tort lawyers almost immediately. Quickly, the heads of CDC and the NIH also sent out a short article to the Journal of the American Medical Association published that denounced what had happened, explained the protections now in place, and tried to reassure everybody that, of course, this could never happen again, and described it as of something that happened at a different time. So therefore, the melodrama of a bad doctor, a differing time, and innocent victims played out again against the apology for wrongdoing sent in another country at another time. And this is the webpage the government has put up. As you might expect, while we await what the Commission on Bioethical Issues finds out, a law firm found 7 individuals in Guatemala who have claimed that they were harmed by the studies and have now filed a lawsuit against the United States under something called the Alien Tort Statute of 1789, which allows U.S. courts to hear claims from non-U.S. citizens about breaches in law outside our borders. More awaits, I suspect, although I understand the Guatemalan government was not so pleased by this turn of events, and I suspect that they are doing their own negotiations with the U.S. and our Bioethics Commission. In conclusion, the scholarly literature on race and melodrama warns us that it will be very difficult to escape such a way of telling the story, and my own struggles back up that analysis. I accept that the first steps, and only the first steps, to change requires that there be an acknowledgement that something horrible happened. I tried in many of the media interviews to remind people that an apology only does that, acknowledges an error or a wrongdoing, but does not predict or control future behavior. I made an effort to make sure that the differences between what happened in Tuskegee and Guatemala were clear, sort of made it really bluntly clear, even if the same seemingly bad guy doctor linked them together, and I refused to vote, although I was asked this many times, on which one was worse. I made the case that today, with the widespread globalization of clinical trials now taking place outside the United States, and the increases coming from such research, how we regulate and watch over human subject research in other countries really matters. This is a story in Vanity Fair last year about this issue, and this is another one in The American Scientist, New Scientist. I have argued that a search for other terrible studies might not be worthwhile, while focusing on what we are really doing now really does matter. I made an effort to explain that a binary of endless medical research and violation of human rights are not necessary, even if making more regulations are not often the solutions. In the end, I think we need the melodrama, the reminder of the horror of the stories, in part to motivate us with tears to actually begin to think and take action. In the face of moral confusion and disarray, critic Linda Williams concludes, melodrama is organized around a paradoxical quest for full articulation of truth and virtue at precisely those junctures when truth and virtue are most vexed. And yet the stories of the studies in Tuskegee and Guatemala may not seem vexed at all to those who only hear them through rumor, quick media accounts, or the emotion of the horrible and the abhorrent. The melodrama of these two studies helps us begin to focus our concerns. Whether we just weep or make change, I think, depends on how we understand why these studies happened in the first place and how much emotion motivates us toward complex changes in social policy, not just in wringing our hands, moaning over simple evil by seemingly bad men, and making up more procedural regulations. Melodrama makes for emotive, but ultimately, I think, limited theater, and even for limited performative apology. If history is to contribute to bioethics policymaking and thinking, we need to make the values of the past visible, to understand what was once seen as normative, and to give the past its pastness as we explain its contemporary relevance. While melodramatic history may get us to pay attention, it is ultimately, I think, a poor guide to making social policy and to achieving justice. Thank you.